He is lying on a bed in a palace that isn't his own, in a city he conquered, thousands of miles from the home he will never see again. Outside, an empire stretches from the shores of Greece to the edge of India, the largest the world has ever known. And yet, in this room, none of that matters anymore. He is 32 years old. He is burning with fever. And within days, the man who never lost a battle will be dead. How does someone build an empire that spans 3 continents before most people have even settled into a career? How does a boy from a small kingdom on the edge of the Greek world end up worshipped as a god in Egypt, feared across Persia, and remembered more than 2,000 years later as one of the most consequential humans who ever lived? This is the story of Alexander of Macedon. Some called him the Great, others called him a destroyer, but almost everyone who ever heard his name never forgot it. To understand how he conquered the known world, you first have to understand where he came from, because nothing about his rise was supposed to happen. Macedon, in the 4th century BCE, was considered a backwater by the sophisticated city-states of southern Greece. Athens had its philosophers. Sparta had its warriors. Macedon had mountains, tribal politics, and a reputation for being half-civilized at best. To the Athenians, Macedonians were barely Greek at all. That began to change under one man, Philip II, Alexander's father. Philip was a brilliant and ruthless king who transformed Macedon's army into the most advanced fighting force in the ancient world. He pioneered the sarissa, a spear nearly twice the length of anything used by rival armies, and reorganized his infantry into a formation known as the phalanx, a wall of interlocking spears that could grind down almost any opponent. By the time Alexander was a teenager, Macedon wasn't a backwater anymore. It was becoming a war machine. And into that war machine, Philip poured everything he had into his son. Alexander's education was unlike anything else in the ancient world. His tutor for several critical years was Aristotle, one of the greatest minds in human history. Under Aristotle's guidance, the young prince studied philosophy, medicine, science, and rhetoric. He developed a lifelong obsession with Homer's Iliad, reportedly sleeping with a copy beneath his pillow. He saw himself, some historians suggest, not merely as a king in training, but as a hero in the mold of Achilles, someone destined for glory, and perhaps someone destined to die young in pursuit of it. At 16, Alexander was already leading troops into battle. At 18, he commanded the cavalry that shattered the sacred band of Thebes at the Battle of Chaeronea, a victory that gave Macedon dominance over the Greek city-states. He was, by every account, a natural, fearless, fast, almost reckless in his hunger to prove himself. Then, in 336 BCE, everything changed in an instant. Philip was assassinated at his daughter's wedding, struck down by one of his own bodyguards. The motive remains debated among historians to this day. Some point to a personal grudge, others suspect a wider conspiracy, possibly reaching into the royal court itself. No one has ever proven exactly who ordered it, if anyone did at all. What is certain is what happened next. At just 20 years old, Alexander was declared king of Macedon. And almost immediately, the vultures began circling. Rebellions broke out. Greek cities sensed weakness and rose up. Neighboring tribes tested the borders. A lesser man might have been swallowed by the chaos. Alexander responded with terrifying speed and brutal efficiency, crushing revolt after revolt within months. When the city of Thebes rebelled, he made an example of it, destroying the city almost entirely, an act that sent an unmistakable message across the Greek world. Defiance would not be tolerated. By the time he turned 22, Alexander's throne was secure. But he wasn't interested in simply holding what his father had built. He wanted Persia. The Persian Empire, at the time, was the largest and wealthiest empire on earth, a vast multicultural superpower stretching from modern-day Turkey to the borders of India. To attack it wasn't ambitious, it was almost unthinkable. And yet, in 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia with an army of roughly 40,000 men, determined to bring down an empire 20 times the size of his own kingdom. His first major test came at the Battle of the Granicus River, where Alexander personally led cavalry charges so close to the front lines that he was nearly killed, saved, according to ancient accounts, at the last possible second by one of his officers. It was a pattern that would define his entire military career. Alexander didn't command from behind the lines. He fought in the front row, sword in hand, risking his own life again and again in ways that seem almost impossible for a supreme ruler to justify. Some historians argue this reckless bravery inspired fanatical loyalty among his troops. Others suggest it reflected a deeper psychological need to prove himself worthy of the legend he believed he was destined to become. Victory followed victory. City after city fell, sometimes through brutal siege, sometimes through negotiated surrender. And then, in 333 BCE, Alexander faced the Persian king himself, Darius III, at the Battle of Issus. Despite being significantly outnumbered, Alexander's forces broke the Persian lines through superior tactics and sheer audacity. Darius fled the battlefield, abandoning his own mother, wife, and children in his haste to escape. It was a humiliation from which the Persian Empire would never fully recover, and a moment that revealed something crucial about Alexander. He wasn't just lucky. He was one of the most gifted military tacticians in human history, capable of reading a battlefield and exploiting an enemy's weakness in real time, under unimaginable pressure. From there, his campaign moved south into Egypt. He arrived not as a foreign invader, but, remarkably, as a liberator. The Egyptians, who had chafed under Persian rule for generations, welcomed him. He was crowned pharaoh, and according to ancient sources, he made a pilgrimage deep into the desert to consult the oracle of Amun at Siwa, where, some accounts claim, he received confirmation of his divine parentage. Whether Alexander truly believed himself descended from a god, or simply understood the political value of the claim, remains one of the enduring debates among historians. What's undeniable is that from this point forward, the myth of Alexander began to eclipse the man. In 331 BCE, he faced Darius one final time, at the Battle of Gaugamela, one of the most consequential battles in world history. Alexander's forces were outnumbered by a staggering margin, facing an army that, according to ancient sources, may have included scythed chariots, war elephants, and troops drawn from across the entire Persian Empire. Modern historians caution that ancient numbers were often exaggerated for dramatic effect, but even by conservative estimates, Alexander was significantly outmatched. And yet, through a combination of deception, discipline, and a devastating cavalry maneuver aimed directly at Darius's position, Alexander broke the Persian army for the last time. Darius fled once more, only to be assassinated shortly afterward by his own subordinates. A final, almost poetic collapse of the empire that had once ruled the known world. Alexander was now the master of Persia. He was 25 years old. Most conquerors would have stopped there. Alexander did not. He pushed further east, through brutal terrain and hostile territory, into regions that modern geographers now recognize as Afghanistan and parts of Central Asia, lands so difficult that Persian kings themselves had struggled to control them. His army faced guerrilla resistance, extreme weather, and supply lines stretched to their breaking point. Still, he pressed forward. By 326 CE, Alexander had crossed into India, where he fought one of the most difficult battles of his career against King Porus at the Hydaspes River, a battle involving war elephants that reportedly terrified even his most seasoned soldiers. He won, but something inside his army had begun to fracture. His men, many of whom had been marching and fighting for nearly a decade, thousands of miles from home, had simply had enough. At the banks of the Hyphasis River, they refused to go any further. It wasn't a mutiny in the traditional sense. It was something quieter and more devastating: exhaustion. Total, bone-deep exhaustion. For the first time in his life, Alexander was forced to turn back, not because he was defeated on the battlefield, but because his own men could not follow the dream any longer. The retreat through the Gedrosian Desert was, by many historical accounts, more devastating than any battle Alexander ever fought. Thousands of soldiers, along with camp followers and animals, are believed to have died from heat, thirst, and starvation. It was a sobering reminder that even the greatest military mind of the ancient world could not conquer geography itself. Alexander eventually made his way back to Babylon, one of the great cities of the ancient world, intending, according to several ancient historians, to consolidate his empire and possibly plan further campaigns, potentially into Arabia. He began integrating Persian customs into his court, adopting Persian dress, and encouraging his officers to marry into Persian nobility. Some historians interpret this as a genuine attempt to unify his sprawling empire into a single, blended civilization. Others argue it was primarily about cementing his own authority, or that later writers exaggerated the extent of these policies to fit a particular narrative about Alexander's vision. Then, in June of 323 BCE, in the same city where his conquests had effectively peaked, Alexander fell ill. The symptoms, as described in ancient sources, included high fever, abdominal pain, and a gradual, agonizing decline over roughly 10 to 12 days. He died shortly after. What actually killed him remains one of history's most persistent unsolved mysteries. Some historians have proposed malaria. Others suggest typhoid fever. There are theories involving West Nile virus, and even a rare autoimmune condition. A more dramatic theory, poisoning, has circulated for centuries, fueled by the sheer number of enemies and rivals Alexander had accumulated by the end of his life. Modern medical historians remain divided, and without physical remains to examine using modern forensic techniques, the true cause of death may never be definitively confirmed. What is certain is only this: at 32 years old, the man who had conquered an empire spanning roughly 2 million square miles was gone. His death triggered immediate chaos. Alexander left no clear, undisputed heir, and his most powerful generals, men who had fought alongside him for years, turned on one another almost instantly in a series of brutal conflicts historians now call the Wars of the Successors. Within a few decades, the empire he had built with such relentless speed had fractured into several separate kingdoms, ruled by rival dynasties descended from his own generals.